Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you to our first movie club of the fall 2022 season. Our movie club, as I'm sure you know by now, is very much like a book club. People watch the movies on their own, and then they come together to discuss it. For anyone who might be joining us for the first time, the Massachusetts Historical Society is an independent nonprofit organization. We maintain a research library with an amazing collection of material, including the papers of 3 of the first 6 presidents of the United States. We hold close to 14 million manuscript pages, including letters, diaries, journals, notes, and the papers of authors, community leaders, and protesters in our collection. We make all of this available to researchers for free and have done so for the past 230 years. We also host a wide variety of programs, and we have some amazing things coming up. We're only able to host programs like these thanks to the support of our members and donors, and we hope that you'll return for future events, and we hope you'll support our work by becoming a member or making a donation. We are this evening going to be discussing the film A Civil Affair, which was a great movie discussing an environmental law case that took place in Massachusetts. We are joined by John Williams, who is a PhD candidate at BU, and he, in his academic work, studies Superfund sites, including one in Woburn, although not specifically the one that's covered in the civil action, and is interested in the legislative history of Superfund. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John Williams to get us started. And if people have questions, I would ask that they use the raise hand function or the chat function, and we'll get to as many as we can. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. As Gavin said, I've studied Woburn particularly, and the Superfund program, which would come from this. And so essentially what that was, it was a major 1980 environmental legislation that was passed actually during the lame duck session. So this is where late 1970s stories of children dying from leukemia, like we saw in the film, A Civil Action. These were erupting all over the country. Love Canal is probably the most notable, and there was so much pressure is that it was even at the very end in December, so just before Christmas, before everyone was leaving for the holidays, that this major piece of legislation passed, which was formerly known as the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. And so Woburn was actually at the forefront of this, bringing this to the case. And that's where we saw Ann Anderson, who was one of the mothers that was shown there, one of the parents that lost her son Jimmy Anderson. If you ever take the train station, the commuter rail north of Boston, there is the Jimmy Anderson station there in Woburn, which is part of the Industryplex Superfund site. So Woburn had not just 1, but 2 sites. And there you will actually see that was where there was a Target store there, among many other things. But this was the first site in the United States that was redeveloped for productive reuse. And so that really, Woburn played an essential role, not just in forming, creating this and bringing awareness to it, but it also then as well kept reforming and kept being kind of this revolutionary, the center of this legislative program. I think one thing that's important to note too is that we kind of saw in this, of course, there's a lot of, it's very difficult to pinpoint where this pollution comes from, especially when we get to the water. And so in this case, you may have noticed during the film, they had these geologists in, and they were talking about glaciers. And this is one thing that makes New England and this area very unique, is that actually when the glaciers receded, it left the sediment that was very pervious. And so essentially in this area, the surface and groundwaters are very closely connected. And so as I mentioned, the Industryplex Superfund site, which I study, it's about half a mile north from wells G and H. So, and there was a bunch of pollution there as well. And really this is part of the Aberjona River, which is part of the Mystic River watershed, which is just one of the first, there's just pollution all over. And the Mystic River drains into the Boston Harbor. And so there's a long history there of where some of these places too, where there's pollution over 100 years. And so trying to figure out who actually caused it was very difficult, and to prove that in a legal case, as we saw in A Civil Action. Just some kind of general thoughts though throughout the film as well. Of course, it focused on John Travolta's character, Jan Schlickman, And there was some things there that as I was mentioning, Anne Anderson was one thing. It really downplayed her role. And actually, one thing, if you may have noticed or not, is that just even her appearance was set very into the 1990s versus having the 1980s perm kind of thing. And so they very much adapted the film kind of to the time. So it came out in 1998. But that was one thing that, as me as a scholar, that was also looking at this, that was, you know, it kind of downplayed her as a minor role when actually she went and she testified to Congress. She kept fighting and organizing. And that's one thing that this film does, is where it kind of has this white knight, this one individual who comes and saves the day and sacrifices everything, when really in reality, it was a lot of it, especially mothers, but all throughout the country. These individuals starting these grassroots organizations and really bringing attention and holding the government's feet to the fire, to say, in a certain extent. And so that was where Andy Anderson was in it. There's also a local clergyman Bruce Young, who also played an important role. And what's important with this case in particular that wasn't also talked is that it set, when this case came out, essentially there's this neighborhood in Woburn by these wells, and all these children started getting leukemia, bunch of other medical issues, and they actually worked together with the Massachusetts Department of Health and the CDC and actually had this kind of revolutionary, first of its kind study that showed that the rates of cancer, of leukemia, especially among children, was in the community in general, is far higher than the rest of the country. So that's also where Woburn played an important role of just bringing awareness. And with that was important as well. There was a brief mention in the film as with that too, of, you know, is that high? Who knows with leukemia? And that's one thing to also understand is during this is when these toxic outbreaks were happening all throughout the country. So these are just 2 sites in Woburn itself, but there's thousands of these. There's about 14 to 1,600 of them throughout the country. So even though this is one area, it's all throughout. And so people were getting sick and they just didn't really know what was happening. And that's something that's still being learned and developed. And this idea of really safety too, of, you know, what's an acceptable amount. Those are kind of just some of my really quick general overview thoughts, first initial thoughts. So I can hand it back over to Olivia or Gavin, or any questions.
Sure. So I think that the movie, just, you know, having watched it this weekend, one thing that I found very amazing is, you know, it was made, I think, do you remember the date of the film?
That was 1998.
1998. So it doesn't seem like it was all that long ago, but Boston looks very different. The opening scene, you're coming in over the Charles River and you can see the Mass Ave Bridge, and there's downtown Boston in the distance. And a lot of buildings that you see today aren't there. And it's just sort of like interesting how dramatically the city has changed between 1998 and today. And that's, you know, 24 years. That's a decent amount of time, but it's also not a lifetime. We're happy to entertain questions from the audience. If people have comments or questions and anything they would like to bring up, that would be great. One question that I have is, you know, how important was this specific case in terms of changing environmental law? Do you have a sense of, was this really like the case that changed things, or is it one of many?
So this case at the time was the largest settlement. And so it was really big. I mean, the amount of money, but going back and looking through it, I mean, this is where EPA lawyers were actually working at the same time. And there's actually a local journalist named Dan Kennedy who actually wrote about this and said, well, honestly, this case kind of delayed certain things by having this big millions of dollars. It made these companies kind of hold back from working with the EPA. So while it was, you know, it was big on its own, and the settlement that actually came from it, in certain ways, it also then deflects from how the government itself was working to hold these companies responsible. And so that's also part of it as well, of the Superfund was the polluter pays. That was kind of the simple goal of it, but it was much more complicated as they found out.
And do you know much about the personal life of the lawyer, John Travolta's character? Do you have any information on how he fared in the end? They certainly suggested that he went on to be an environmental lawyer. Was he a major player going forward?
He was. I don't know a whole lot about his life specifically, but what I do know is with this Superfund program, it was in the mid-1990s, especially after the 94 election where Republicans, Newt Gingrich, take over the House, is that there was a lot of pushback, and really these conservatives, especially even under Reagan, were trying to constantly take down Superfund essentially. And that's where Massachusetts played an important role, because Ed Markey, who was the representative at the time in Woburn, now the senator representing Massachusetts, he's been like a steadfast champion of Superfund and really has defended and has used things like Woburn as an example of this is what these conservatives want to do. They want to cut this, take this away. This is going to lead, it's going to stop cleanups. It's going to stop these settlements. So Schlickman, though, then too, he would be involved where Markey actually brought people together along with Carol Browner, who was the Clinton's EPA administrator, and they went to Woburn itself. They went to Industryplex, so the site that's just north of it. But it's just, they kind of made a big stand there, and the Boston Globe even had a report about it and all of that.
Great. So we're happy to have any questions from audience members, or if there's anyone in the audience who may have actually lived through some of this stuff, we'd love to hear some of your reflections, since we are generally in the Boston area, although not exclusively. So feel free to raise your hand or use the chat function if you would like to make a comment. So personally, just reflecting on, oops, Olivia, were you gonna?
I was just going to say that you had briefly mentioned the role of mothers in pushing this forward, and I thought that was interesting. So I just wondered if you could say a little more about that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, that's one thing where mothers just in general, just gender roles, of course, and traditional gender roles in that have been at the forefront of not just the Superfund and addressing pollution, but really the environmental movement itself. And part of this even goes back to the 1960s with smog in places such as New York and Los Angeles in particular, where we see these mothers kind of organizing. And part of this was, some of it was kind of freedom for them, but it was also this idea of I need to protect these children. That's my role in the family. And so the mothers played a huge role. And also just as well, of course, there's children that suffered, and that's what caught the headlines and really pushed for action to happen, because it's how can you just let these children die who are so young? But it was also that it was affecting a lot of reproductive health as well, which was like another issue with it. So even though certain individuals didn't die, there was, with these hearings in the 1980 major hearing where Andy Anderson and two other local residents from Woburn testified, is that was a common theme as well throughout the whole country, is that people are talking about, look, my neighbor there had a stillborn, that happened, and they're pointing them out. And knowing about that and tying with that as well, I mean, that's something with the water was just another thing, and the smell. That's what like really connected all these people as well, is just the smell is something that just had it, and it's tough to imagine too, but that's one thing that connected all of them. They knew something was wrong through smell, and that's just being concerned of like, is this going to hurt my child giving them this water? Is it just a little off, or what's going to be, the city says it's fine, the state says it's fine. And so that's like another issue as well with it. And though, I guess just to add to, it's really mothers though that were organizing and spreading national awareness about this as well. So while Ann Anderson was working and Schlickman representing the parents to fight for this lawsuit, she's also traveling the country and organizing as ways to bring awareness.
So we have a couple questions that came in over the chat. One was a question about who has been left out in terms of local officials or town or state people who are engaged in this fight. Were there sort of active players who weren't represented in the film? And obviously, you mentioned that the mothers were downplayed and that the church leaders, and to some degree, weren't really given any credit. But were there also town and state officials who were involved in this?
Yes, so that's where, as I mentioned, Ed Markey, this would be later on. Ted Kennedy was also, he chaired this big hearing that led to the creation of Superfund. But if we talk about left out, this is one of the things where there was a lot of just people in general were left out. So what happened with Woburn is if you're a local resident, around the time, Woburn had this stigma, or this it was known as the Woburn odor. And so people always talked about driving by, you know, roll your windows up kind of thing. And so again, the smell is something that people were thinking about. And so with this, though, that happened, you know, they kept trying to local residents, like what's going on, talking to local officials. Well, the first that was called in was then the Army Corps of Engineers, finally after several years. So this went on from, for that instance, there was a major development. Long story short, they dug up all these carcasses. It used to be a tannery there, and they're covered in resin and all this terrible stuff, arsenic. And so the smell, the developer just kept going on. No concern, even though the workers were like, this is terrible. They described it as like a rotten egg, like heinous odor. So long story short, then from that is the Army Corps of Engineers comes in, later the EPA, and they're looking and investigating and see what's going on. But it would take months until the local officials were actually notified. So even the Massachusetts, their environmental agency during the time, knew what was going on, but didn't tell the local officials. And the only way the town found out is actually a local newspaper had this daunting headline, that's the lagoon of arsenic discovered. And so, and you know, that's, I mean, where some part of this comes from as well, of just this idea of trust. That was one thing that Ted Kennedy had this powerful statement in the opening hearing that would lead to Superfund, where he was saying, you know, we've lost trust, and that might be the hardest thing ever to get back. So that's kind of also why this is important, because people aren't trusting government. They don't trust us to protect them, to protect their health.
Yeah, and Pat wrote in and said that Schlickman went on into partnership with Thomas Sobel, the attorney who won the settlement from the tobacco industry. No surprise, their partnership didn't last long, but Sobel is still in product litigation. Pat also went on to ask if the property values in Woburn ever came back, which if there was a Woburn odor, hopefully there no longer is, and perhaps the property values got better, but I don't know.
Yes, they did, and this then relates to the site I've focused on most, which is the Industryplex site, and this was part of the issue. So essentially, what happened before this redevelopment? This would be throughout the mid-1990s. So as this film was being made, actually, that's when it was Target Stores, the Minneapolis retailer, big box store, was the first to do this partnership, and so the film came out during the same time, and it's kind of interesting even too of a. Just talking about the site itself, of how that's another thing that was left out. But that was part of it as well, because before then, basically what happened is with these sites is they essentially would clean them up. A lot of times they would just cap them, so they would leave the contaminants there and basically put these big sheets of plastic over them. Is the simple way to think about it. And so they would just fence them off, and they were just left there. And that was where, even in Woburn, all these places, of course, the wells weren't. I mean, it was water. They were, I'm sure, fenced off as well. But these areas were fenced. You know, there's even then stories too of kids being kids, taking their bikes and riding through it, and there's still dust that's hazardous and everything, and it's being kicked up. So these sites were just left there. And so that's what made Woburn important, because of it having this long and rich history, and this importance and kind of a national attention about this toxic contamination, really catastrophe, you know, all over the country, is that then it became this redevelopment program. And now that's where there's even like a Raytheon office building there. There's an upscale hotel and all these other things. And so the area now, if you go, you cannot even tell that it would be that, you know, there's a Superfund site there unless you know. And that was part of the idea too, which is we're going to take this away. But I mean, its location is it's basically at the intersection of I-93 and I-95. So it's right along Route 128. So kind of the high-tech corridor. And so this was prime real estate. And with how Boston's been growing, of course, it's, you know, redevelop and use what land you can use. Gavin, as you were mentioning too, just kind of a side note of Boston looking so much different. This is where there's these Superfund sites, which are the worst of the worst contaminants, but there's thousands, tens of thousands of other of these lesser polluted called brownfield sites. And so that's where with this, it's a branch from the Superfund program, but that's in the 2000s is really where that took off. So that's where a lot of these places that used to be polluted could be remediated and redeveloped. And so if you do walk around Boston today and you see, you know, an empty lot, it's probably a brownfield site. That's in like many cities with kind of this new kind of back to the city and redevelopment that's been happening in recent years.
Yeah, I live in Cambridge, and I know that there's sort of community lore that sites that are empty were emptied because of the planned construction of a 6-lane highway called the Inner Belt, which was eventually opposed by community groups and was never built. But almost every single one of those sites that people think was a house demolished for the Inner Belt is actually a site of like a former dry cleaner or something. Like, you know, the real estate is too valuable. It's not like you would just knock down a building and not build on it for 30 years. So there's usually a reason that there's nothing there. So we have a couple questions that have been typed into the text. John said, can you tell us about the roles of Grace Corp, Beatrice Foods in the tanning operation? And also said Woburn now has a problem with PFAs in the water. Does that relate at all to this site?
As far as, I'll start with the PFAs, and I don't know if that, I don't know specifically. My guess is that it would not have related to the site. There's a lot of different things. I mean, there could be with production. A lot of it I know with a lot of military bases, with what they use for extinguishing fires contains this type of material. So I don't know specifically with that, but that's also a new thing that we're discovering. And that's kind of where in the 1980s of these new toxic and chemicals that were also being developed. Some are old, but I mean, we're still learning more and more about them. And on that note, the EPA, I believe, did just make a decision to regulate those chemicals, if I remember right, like just recently. But that's a whole another problem by itself. Sorry, what was the first part of that question?
The roles of
got to hear Grace. Yes, I don't know specifically about Beatrice or the tanning operations. From what I do know with Grace Corporations, though, is that they were responsible for several of these cleanup Superfund sites throughout the country. It was a very large business at the time, like kind of a conglomerate that had involved many different industries. And it's much smaller now, but it's actually, it would later on become kind of a responsible, like especially environmentally responsible company, which may sound kind of odd, but that's where I'm getting that from that local journalist I mentioned, Dan Kennedy, who was very critical of the film itself, but he did in another piece make the point of like, look at what Grace actually has done. They've really turned things around and took this to heart in certain ways. So I'm sorry, I can't answer about the other companies.
And Beatrice is like one of the largest companies, or I don't know if it still exists in its current form, but it was at one point one of the largest companies in the world. It was colossal. So, and Michelle asked a question about if the Boston Athenaeum was in the movie, and I can answer that definitely. Like a huge portion of this movie is filmed in the Boston Athenaeum. So like many legal offices are actually the Boston Athenaeum. And it's a beautiful building. So but you actually see a couple different rooms from different perspectives. So they're actually using the same room just from a different angle, a different purpose. So but it is a wonderful facility. And John, I imagine, right, the same John, ask if in such cases, are there ever criminal charges against plant managers or like personal lawsuits, I guess?
Yeah, so I don't know specific examples. And this was one thing the film kind of touched on as well from it, of this idea of I forget one of the businesses was saying, well, this wasn't illegal at the time. And that's one of the issues with this. So what the Superfund program did in 1998 is it combined with several other, this was kind of the last of really like the environmental decade, as historians call it, the 1970s. And this was the end of it, of really, hampering down on pollution, especially chemicals, and landfills was part of it as well. And so there were strong incentives basically, or controls to prevent pollution from happening. So this absolute irresponsible type of thing. So there wasn't criminal charges necessarily that I know in many of these sites that I've looked at, just because, while they did things that were negligent and irresponsible, there was also no laws at the time. So that's where the idea of the swimming hole that they talked, or swimming pool they talked about, that was a common thing. And that's where, especially around this area, in Woburn and north of Boston, there was industry that went there just around, back to the Civil War, essentially. So 100 years, and what businesses used to do is basically they took wetlands or ditches and they just dumped whatever into it, covered it up and moved to the next one and just kept doing that over and over. And that's what caused some of this problem then of, like, as I mentioned, the Industryplex site is this developer comes in and digs up all this old hazardous waste. So it was, I mean, that's, that's one of the things with it is that in these companies, I mean, I think that there is some legitimacy to it to say like, well, it wasn't illegal at the time. We didn't know it was going to cause this, and now we do. So I don't know about specific cases of, I mean, there are, not that I know of with Superfund, but of, irresponsible pollution but not to the scale, or at least in these sites themselves. So it's more liability than a criminal charge.
So I have a question, which is a little bit outside of the movie, but it's just about the Superfund. How does the Superfund compare to programs in other countries? Like, America was not the only country that industrialized, so it wasn't the only country that polluted, and it wasn't the only country that has had problems like this. And I think that certainly there are countries that are more industrial today, and sort of leaving those aside, but more looking at essentially first world nation, or first leading economies of the world. How does this program compare to other programs in comparable countries?
That is a great question, and I wish I could answer it fully. I do know that I have seen other countries have like a Superfund type of program. I don't know though specifically of how they would. That actually that's pretty fascinating, because you're right. I mean, especially in places like in like Germany or in Britain, especially like northern England, I imagine. I mean, there has to be polluted sites all over. So
it's a project for another dissertation.
Yeah, exactly. If anybody's out there looking for topic ideas.
So Pat wrote, would that illegality of dumping be state or local? I imagine it would be, if it wasn't illegal at the time, it wasn't illegal either. But presumably and you can correct me because I'm sure you know this more than I do, but was the influx of environmental laws following court cases like this and political action like this, did they change federal law, or did they begin with local and state laws and then move up to the federal?
So for this one in particular, it was the federal level. For Superfund, I know that there was some changes with the brownfield at more of a state level, but essentially how this was built, and this is kind of just how environmental legislation works in the United States, this idea of federalism, and especially with the EPA. So the EPA, this is one thing that's unique, I suppose, where they actually come in and have their own lawyers. It's its own separate program to do it, but they're also then working very closely with the state and the local government. There was problems with that, of this cooperation early on, and that's where then we see in 1986 there was a major reauthorization of this, and that was part of the idea, was we're going to work on more cooperation. That's still kind of a continuous thing that even feeds into like with like environmental justice issues today, of this cooperation type of thing. But so there's, in this case, it was though from the federal level explicitly, and then a few states, as I mentioned, these kind of lesser brownfields started their own types of things, their own programs. So
is the like environmental law, I mean, environmental laws were very much under attack recently. Just a very opaque way of saying that, but I think that there's much less support in certain parts of the country. Has the enforcement been has the state that you lived in really determined whether these laws were enforced, even if it was a federal law?
So for Superfund itself, it's been just kind of a mess. It's always been underfunded. There's a lot within that. It does depend where you live and which administration in certain ways. So under the Obama administration, there's finally a focus, especially on non-white minority communities or communities. Under Trump, for instance, though, which is one of the kind of the one green thing Trump did was actually the Superfund program, and he actually cleaned up more sites than had been done since 2000. And when he, under Scott Pruitt being the EPA administrator, a lot of people kind of laughed of like, oh, really, you're going to clean up these sites? And they actually did. But it became also very political, where it was going to rural America, places like West Virginia, especially Appalachia areas, and it was mostly white rural communities where this was going. So yeah, it depends not so much of what state you're in, but of really what the community is like. And so in the Woburn case, let's tie back to the movie too. This was another thing when they showed the neighborhood there. I mean, this was a blue collar, like a working suburb. They make it seem very rural. It's a suburb. It's only a few miles north of Boston, downtown Boston. But they made that the neighborhood where this pollution happened, where these children were affected, was not this rundown type of place that they showed in the film. I mean, and I think that's another thing to think of the time period, perhaps of in the 1980s, of what a working class family would look like. So, think of The Simpsons, right? This large, decent house with one parent, one person as kind of the breadwinner, and they have a decent home. I mean, that's really kind of what it was like, where in the film, they portray it as kind of really this grimy, rundown type of neighborhood, it seemed like. So, and so for that instance, I guess to say is initially, and for a long time, how this has been is it's basically suburban white communities were the ones that got the effort and the funds, and that really were being addressed first.
So we have a question, which is, what is it like to write a dissertation on a topic that has received the Hollywood treatment, or a modern topic with people still alive who lived through the events?
Oh, that is a great question. It's challenging in certain ways, I can say. I mean, of course, it's engaging, but as we're talking about, for myself, when all of this happened, I wasn't born during this lawsuit, so it is a foreign place, a different time to me in certain ways. But it also makes it to where you have to kind of use some investigative journalism types of things. So I've had to do FOIA requests. I've actually gotten records directly from Woburn, which, it's great. Not all, it's different with every municipal level. You really just have to kind of look. In particular, my dissertation, this is a small part of it. I'm doing an environmental history of Target, big box stores. I think I mentioned that. So it was also, this was one of those ways that I could find out, because there are the government records that are available. But even with that, like as I mentioned, having to do FOIA requests, and sometimes you get those, sometimes you don't. I've had where it's taken 2 years and I get a random email and I'm just like, oh wow, I forgot I even did this. And sometimes a lot of it's redacted. Other times, yeah, it's hit and miss. So that's a great question. Thank you.
So I wonder if there's anyone within our audience who actually remembers living through this and has anything that they'd like to share about that. I do know that a while ago, there was a comment from the Jenks Center that said it was a normal experience in the area to commute to Boston to hospital visits weekly. And I sort of missed that comment at the time. And Rose has just posted a comment that said, there's a wonderful visual metaphor in the film where the Mystic River Bridge shows how things are often seemingly impossible to solve. At one point, when the major character is driving into Boston, the misbuilt exit on the Mystic River Bridge was shown from below. This exit went out into space for perhaps 15 yards. It could never connect to anything. When I saw that, I thought that was the bridge to the Inner Belt going into Somerville, or the planned highway, the Inner Belt, which would have essentially been like, 495, but in the urban core of Boston, and would have connected 93 and 95 to 90, going through Somerville into Cambridge, running through Central Square, and then across the river, close to where the BU Bridge is, and then through Roxbury. And it would have been an elevated 6-lane highway And so that exit ramp, if it's the correct one that I'm thinking of, and Rose is going to tell me that I'm wrong, because she just raised her hand, goes into the neighborhood, which is known as the Inner Belt in Somerville. But perhaps I'm wrong. But Rose, would you like to unmute?
I have done it. Okay. And now, Gavin, I think you're wrong. But I will stand corrected if someone has the information. Evidently, when the Mystic River Bridge was being built, people were following a blueprint and they just kept building this thing. And it just went out and couldn't connect to anything. And it was there for years. And it was actually on the Mystic River Bridge, I think on the lower level.
All right.
And if anyone else remembers when Woburn smelled, they may remember my exit to no place. But I thought it was a wonderful metaphor for the whole difficult situation.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I am willing to believe that I'm totally wrong about that. I do know that there is still an exit to nowhere that goes to what should have been the Inner Belt. But there may have been an earlier one too, or a different one. Anyways.
I have a comment.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I was a medical student in the early 1970s in Buffalo, New York. And I had a rotation with a neurologist who worked in Niagara Falls. And he said to me, I'm seeing so many cases of brain tumors. There's so many more than should be in this population, in young people. And it was before we knew about Love Canal. And, you know, there was this miasma that was toxic and nobody knew, I mean, figuratively a miasma, and nobody knew what the cause was, but something terrible was invading the community. It's sort of like the invasion of the body snatchers.
Thank you very much for sharing, Jill.
Yeah, I just add to that, was that Jill, I believe, asked that question? Yeah, very good word there, miasma. I like that. But no, that's something that, I mean, that's throughout the country, that was an issue of this happening, and especially medical people recognizing like something's not right here, but that it's also, how do you prove that? How do you show what's going on? And so, yeah, it wasn't until then it was, you know, really becoming national news all over. And Love Canal was, of course, one of the major ones, but there's also like the Valley of Drums in Kentucky was another one, and such like this. And of course, Woburn. So.
I live right on the Aberjona River. I've lived there 40 years. And when I live on Swanton Street in Winchester, right next to the river. And when we moved there, they told us, oh, don't let your kids, you know, play in the river, and, you know, to get mud on there. But there's a testing station in my yard, and they still test for arsenic. They were there yesterday, you know, after every big event, you know, rain event, they test for arsenic. I talked to them, they say, oh, the arsenic doesn't get down this far. So I said, oh, how far down does it get? They didn't answer that question. I don't know. But they still test, you know, for arsenic.
Glad to hear that they're still testing.
I guess that's good news.
And thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So, Jackie, if you lived in the area for 40 years, how true did the movie seem to you?
It seemed accurate to me. You know, it's interesting hearing how, you know, they kind of played up the John Travolta role, and, you know, kind of played down the other roles, which, you know, that was news to me. But yeah, it rang pretty true to me. You know, the talk about the Woburn odor, and it was pretty shocking, all the, you know, cases of leukemia. I mean, we had young kids, and you're saying, you know, wow, what's, you know, it was pretty alarming.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that things worked out for you.
Yeah, we kept the kids out of the river.
Olivia, were you about to say something?
Yeah, not to disrupt all the personal reminiscing, but I was going to ask about environmental issues in film, and if you had any thoughts about like how that's been portrayed and how this movie like compared to you know, large other stories like this.
Oh, great question, Olivia. The film that comes closest to mind, which I believe was right around the same time, was Aaron Brockovich, which again, this was another instance of kind of showing this one individual is kind of saving the day and really solving it when it's much more complicated, and also sometimes in it that too ignores the kind of grassroots efforts or the parents and things like this involved that are bringing attention to this before that individual comes in. Gosh, that's great. I can't think of any other examples. I don't know if anybody else, it might be a great question.
Yeah, I have to say off the top of my head, I can't think of many films that have a lot of heavy environmental themes or environmental law themes in them. But our speaker that we had last night, which was just on a regular author talk, whose name was Michael Meltzner, who is the former dean of Northeastern Law and had been very involved in civil rights litigation. When just offhandedly we mentioned that we were talking about this movie today, he was like, "Oh, that's a great depiction of the case. It's very accurate about how the case was tried." Well, you're thinking about this in a very legal perspective, but he seemed very pleased that the case was accurately shown, or how it went through the legal system was accurately shown. John Brown mentioned that Dark Waters is a great recent movie, quite similar to that one, and is about the PFAs. Yeah, and I'm sort of racking my brain trying to think of movies related to environmental law or pollution.
That's why I asked, because I was thinking like, oh, it seems like I could think of maybe documentaries, but I couldn't really think of a lot of films. So it's interesting that, this was made.
I will say it is interesting, I guess, even too, because this was, of course, the lawsuit itself was big, but I'm even just thinking of like Love Canal, of how big of a national story that was, but I don't know of any films about that. So
yeah, it's interesting. Well, we are getting towards the end of the hour, so if anyone has any additional questions or comments, I'm sure we have a time to take them, but we also could probably start considering wrapping this up if people are ready. So if anyone else would like to ask a question or make a comment, we would love to hear it. Oh, Rose. You can unmute yourself, Rose.
I would just like to comment about the quality of the acting. There is a moment that Travolta sees the name Beatrice Foods on the side of the truck from the tannery. And there's just a little tiny smile, but it goes all the way to his eyes. He knows he's got something. It is just a beautiful piece of acting. That's all I wanted to say.
I can second that. I thought the acting was very good, and also I hadn't seen the film before, but just was surprised of how many stars were in it as well.
It was actually a really heavily star-studded performance. There is a lot of A-list people for a legal case movie.
Yeah, and from what I was told, this was also kind of John Travolta's like comeback film. I've seen Travolta movies. I don't know though all about his filmography, but
I have a question.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little faint, but we can hear you.
I saw that Robert Duvall was in the movie. What role did he play? I didn't see the movie.
He was the lawyer for, was it for Grace? Or was he for Beatrice? He was one of the corporate lawyers.
I think it was for Beatrice.
Yeah.
He was the big Red Sox fan, right?
Right.
Yeah.
He was an unconventional lawyer who listened to Red Sox games and threw tennis balls against walls and and seemed like he wasn't paying attention.
Thank you. He's a friend of ours.
Oh, it's a good friend to have. Okay, well,
Were
I'm
there
gonna,
other pollutants besides arsenic involved there?
Oh yes, there's tons. There's they even there was kind of early on in the film, one of the lawyers working at the firm for Schlickman mentioned, like, I don't even know how to pronounce this, and that's, I mean, so much of that all over. So all these, you know, alphabet soup in certain ways, but also just a mouthful of words for these harmful carcinogenic contaminants, pollutants.
Yeah.
Just
Thank you.
a little factoid, which I just checked. Travolta came back in 1994 with Pulp Fiction, and that was 4 years before this film.
that was a big comeback. Okay, well, it's getting towards the end of the hour. So John, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing all of your expertise about environmental law. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I think, you know, it really was a great movie to watch. So I hope people have watched it or will watch it this evening or this weekend and enjoy it. So thank you all for joining us.